Today on 10-Minute IT Jams, we're joined by Craig Searle, who is the Director of Consulting and Professional Services for the Pacific at Trustwave. Trustwave detects threats that others can't see, enabling them to respond quickly and protect its clients from the devastating impact of cyber attacks. Trustwave leverages its world-class team of security consultants, threat hunters, and researchers, and its market-leading security operations platform to relentlessly identify and isolate threats with the right telemetry at the right time for the right response. Craig joins us today to tell us more about Trustwaves and his thoughts on crisis management. Thank you for coming along, Craig, and welcome to the Jam.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
You're very welcome. Well, let's get straight into it. Why should organizations invest in developing and stress testing crisis communication plans?
I think probably the biggest thing that we're seeing in the market is that organizations that are well organized and well prepared tend to experience incidents, crisis, or even a minor incident with much less impact than organizations that have either not ever stress tested their crisis management regime, or they haven't really given it ample consideration. If I use an analogy like a sporting team, like you wouldn't expect the Matildas to run onto the field without having done any training. And in the same way that you wouldn't expect a crisis management team to enact during a crisis management playbook during a time of high stress and demand without at least having walked through it and understood what are the weak points, what works well, what doesn't, and making sure that in times of extreme stress that they can be relied on to make the right decisions at the right times.
Well, now, what are some of the most common issues that are identified in simulations?
Probably see three major issues for the simulations. The first one really is around delegations of authority and decision chains. And really what that means is, are the right people empowered to make decisions? And if they're not available, who does that empowerment then flow through to? So often we'll see that delegations will flow from one person to another, but if those two people are not available, it becomes very murky very quickly, and decision-making becomes really problematic and bogged down. So that's the first one. The second one, I think, then relates to making sure that the delegations of authority are actually clear and the people are willing to use them. We often have a nightmare scenario where as a hypothetical, you may have a decision to be made about a server that needs to be shut down in order to prevent further spread of, say, malware, something like that. But shutting down that server will also have a real business impact. And often we'll see that during these crisis management simulations, the executives in charge will be unwilling to make that decision because they're not sure if they actually do have that level of delegation. So it's really important to make sure that people understand how far the delegations of authority go and that they are willing to actually exercise that power. The third one really comes down to communications between teams. And we do see that organizations have challenges when they're handing off decision information between teams. And we do see at times that organizations that are heavily siloed during crisis response tend to have slower, less effective responses. And so it's important that the crisis management team operates as a single cohesive unit. And while, yes, different people in that team will have different skill sets and responsibilities, that the siloing that the business may ordinarily experience doesn't come into the crisis management situation.
Well, now, what are the consequences of having an undefined delegation chain during a cyber crisis?
The biggest one is just lack of speed. So it's unclear as to who is making what decision. There's usually a fair bit of confusion about then who is making the decision, who's not making the decisions is also just as important. And so really that starts to impact speed of response and effectiveness of response. So if you are unclear as to who is making the decision, what then tends to happen is it's unclear as to who is making the decision about who gets to make the decision and so on and so forth. So it really starts to end up becoming a situation where there is a lot of confusion and the responsiveness is obviously impacted as a result.
Well, now, could you tell us more about avoiding paralysis through analysis in crisis management?
Yeah, so that is something that we're seeing happening a lot. It's an interesting kind of trend where A lot of crisis responders tend to find that they are waiting for like another set of information or just one more piece of information to confirm, an assumption or something along those lines. But the reality of crisis simulation or crisis management is that often you're being forced to make decisions with not enough information, under time pressure, that have real world business impacts. And if you continue to wait for more information to become available, you'll often find yourself in a situation where no decision is actually worse than making the wrong decision. And so we talk to our customers about that there are thresholds within which you need to be willing to make a decision and accept the fact that it might not be correct or it might be imperfect. But this is certainly one of those situations where perfect is absolutely the enemy of good. And as part of that crisis response training, it's really important for organizations to be comfortable with being uncomfortable during that decision-making process.
Well, I guess one question to finish off, what are some effective protocols that organizations can have in place to handle cyber attacks?
I think probably the biggest thing I would say is having well understood and well-defined playbooks. And to support those playbooks, it's really important to have roles and responsibilities really clearly defined. There is a bit of a fine line between having playbooks that are too detailed and so don't really allow for the various sort of nuances and shades of grey that you encounter during a crisis, but having playbooks that adequately represent capabilities in the environment and the likely types of incidents you're to experience really helps provide those boundaries for an organization to operate within during a crisis, and then also ensuring that delegations of responsibility are assigned to roles, not individuals, so that it becomes clearer that when someone is operating within a certain role during a crisis, then they have the authority to make decisions of whatever nature. So really, they are the two big things. The last one I would point out is communications is also incredibly important. Often that is typically thought of as communications out to the market and to the public, but it's also really important to understand what communications go to your internal staff members, when and how. They are often just as impacted by these incidents as anyone else. They do often feel like they wear a degree of burden for carrying the organization during that time. And so it's really important to have high quality, regular communications to the internal team, as well as obviously the customers and the general public.
Well, it has been a pleasure having you on the jam again, Craig, and hearing more about Trustwaves and your thoughts on crisis management. We look forward to hearing more from you very soon.
Thanks for having me, Tom.